Welcome to episode 3 of the Gaming Graveyard. Today we're covering Duke Nukem Forever. Duke Nukem Forever has to be one of, if not the most infamous games of all time. I mean, it literally holds a world record for the longest development of a video game. And I don't mean the longest time between sequels, of course, because that would probably be GTA 5 by this point, but no. 14 years actively making a video game. How does one accomplish such a feat, you may be asking? Well, that's what we're covering today. We will be covering the mistreatments, the confusion, and the downright stupidity behind Duke Nukem Forever. Do yourself a favor, grab some snacks, grab a drink, because let's be real, we're going to be here for a while. Okay, maybe I can get through this. Let's go. We're going to start with the founding of 3D Realms. 3D Realms was founded in 1994 by Scott Miller and George Broussard. They met back in high school and must have been at least close friends, but I mean, let's be real, who really cares? But before 3D Realms is founded, they began working on a game called Duke Nukem in 1991 for Apogee. Duke Nukem was different. It wasn't another faceless protagonist in a field of faceless protagonists. It was a very much so in-your-face protagonist who had a very distinct personality. But it wasn't anything near what Duke Nukem would be in the coming years. Broussard would describe Duke as a combination of film stars John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. They would then move on to Duke Nukem 3D, which would be developed and then eventually released in January 1996 and was a massive change for the franchise. By a massive change, I mean it was a massive change. It went from sort of like a superhero game to like a Homelander mixed with Deadpool, if you want to look at it like that. It included things like blood, strippers, porn, you name it, it's probably there. But instead of naming it, just go watch an Adam Sandler movie for like 30 seconds and you'll get the gist of what Duke Nukem is. Now, Duke Nukem 3D would be the first game that 3D Realms would make under the 3D Realms name. And it was an unbelievably successful game under the 3D Realms banner. So they wanted to continue to use the Duke Nukem IP while it was hot. So they licensed it out to others, allowing them to use the IP while they thought of the next adventure for Duke. That is when Duke Nukem Forever was officially announced by 3D Realms on April 27th, 1997. This announcement came barely a year after the release of Duke Nukem 3D. Now, little did everyone know when this announcement actually happened that the game had already had an engine change before the game was even publicly announced. It was initially running on just the original Quake engine. However, the game's director, George Broussard, did not want the game running on an engine that was, well, out of date by this time. So, the change was made. Duke Nukem Forever would proudly run on the Quake engine too. Now, the publishing rights would be handed over to GT Interactive for the marketing and publishing. However, George Broussard and Miller decided to fund Duke Nukem Forever's development with their own money. Now, in hindsight, this was the worst fucking decision that they've ever made in their lives. In August and September, the first ever screenshots of Duke Nukem were released, and it was a relatively impressive showcase of what the game could be. But George Broussard was not happy with the game's progress, so soon after E3, 3D Realms decided they would be making the change to the Unreal Engine. Although the Unreal Engine is a very impressive piece of technology, and even back then was very impressive, all it did was slow the game down. Which is going to unfortunately be a very, very normal thing for 3D Realms. In June 1998, 14 months after announcing that they would be using and proudly claiming that they would be using the Quake Engine 2, they announced that that shit was kind of fucked, so they switched to the Unreal Engine. Broussard, when asked about this change, said that the game would not be significantly delayed, and they expect to be back where they were at E3 within a month to 6 weeks. Now, for anybody who has even remotely tried game development in any way, shape, or form, you would know that this is the most idiotic thing you've ever heard in your entire life. George Broussard was chatting absolute nonsense or just straight up lying. We don't know which one. By the end of 1999, Duke Nukem Forever had missed several release dates. The game at this point was also largely unfinished because of the really dumb idea to keep changing fucking engines. Now, Broussard at this point had begun to get a bit of a reputation by staff. When staff would see him playing a new game or a game that he was enjoying, they would relatively assume that that's what they were going to be adding to their game. December of 2000, GT Interactive would sell their company to Infograins, and the Duke Nukem Forever publishing rights would be handed over to the gathering of developers. But honestly, who really cares? Nothing truly changed about the game. However, after 3 years since Duke Nukem's last showing, George Broussard would finally show another trailer of Duke Nukem Forever at E3 2001. The trailer was pretty impressive to say the least, but by this point, many games in Duke Nukem's first-person shooter genre were looking pretty impressive. However, this may not come as a surprise. It turns out that this trailer was completely fucking fake, and it was all smoke and mirrors. None of it was actually a full-fledged game. By 2003, only 18 people at 3D Realms were working on Duke Nukem Forever. One former employee said that George Broussard and Scott Miller were working with a 1995 mentality. George Broussard was asked when the game would finally ship, and he would famously say, "when it's done." And that is a ballsy statement for a game that had by this point been in development for 7 fucking years. Also around 2003, Take-Two Interactive would get the rights to publish Duke Nukem Forever. And Jeffrey Lappin, the Take-Two CEO, reported that the game would be out in 2003. He also said that the company would be writing off $5.5 million from its earnings due to Duke Nukem Forever's lengthy development. What did George Broussard have to say about this massive statement from the Take-Two Interactive? Take-Two needs to shut the fuck up. We don't want Take-Two saying stupid ass shit in public for the sole purpose of helping out their stock. It's our time and our money we're spending on the game, so either we're absolutely stupid and clueless, or we believe in what we're working on. Yeah, I mean, there's not much more to add there. That is a man who is developing a game for a $1 million company talking about their fucking publisher. That's if Hazelight's CEO got on stage when they won Game of the Year and said, "fuck EA though." It's wild to say that because they're basically spending the money to allow you to make the game you're currently making. But I guess it was a different time back then, so who really knows? Later in 2003, Jeffrey Lappin would say that 3D Realms told him that Duke Nukem Forever was expected to be out by the end of 2004 or early 2005. George Broussard would later deny that this claim was ever made. At some point around 2005, Scott Miller would approach a Canadian developer team, Digital Extremes, known for co-developing games, to take over development of Duke Nukem Forever. He would later say that the game was in deep trouble. Digital Extremes and Take-Two were willing to, but unfortunately the takeover was rejected by others at 3D Realms. And I'm speculating here, and I hate to do so, but if I had to guess, this idea was probably scrapped by George Broussard. In January of 2006, Broussard would say that Duke Nukem Forever was pretty much finished, and they were basically pulling it all together and trying to make it fun. Later that year, Broussard would show off samples of the game, including an earlier level with a vehicle sequence and a few test rooms. Among the features seen was the interactive use of an in-game computer. This in-game computer could actually send emails. Now, if you're thinking that sounds like a completely useless thing to have in a game that's been in development hell, you'd be correct. Take-Two would then reveal that they renegotiated the Duke Nukem Forever deal, with Take-Two receiving $4.25 million instead of $6 million on the game's release. Take-Two also offered a $500,000 bonus if Duke Nukem was released by 2007. George Broussard, however, did not care about these bonuses and would never ship a game early. I'm not sure exactly what he thought early meant, but buddy, I think we missed that deadline. Let's back up a little bit. 3D Realms staff for the entire development of Duke Nukem Forever were fresh out of college and brand new hires who had no other game resume experience. And they were paid below the industry standard. They would make their money off of profit sharing, but without any games, there's not a whole lot of profit being shared by not a lot of people. So they continued to leave the company on a consistent basis. They had to continue to replace staff, and obviously, as we've seen in LA Noir's video, that does not go well. By this point in 2006, George Broussard and Miller's relationship had strained. After the relationship began to strain, George Broussard appeared to be more motivated to actually shipping the game. So, with the relationship straining, George Broussard made a judgment call and they hired a ton of people, almost doubling their current size, and got to work. Among these hires was one Brian Hook. Brian Hook was hired to be a new lead on the game. He would be the first person to tweak or deny George Broussard's requests if he felt it would slow the game down. In-game footage in 2008 would be shown in an episode of the Jace Hall Show. It was pretty crappy, to be honest, and you couldn't really see much as the camera was shaking as if they were having a stroke behind it, but hey, people didn't really get excited anyway, so it doesn't really fucking matter. By this point in 2008, 3D Realms' money bags were starting to dry up, and they had to start looking to Take-Two Interactive for money to finish the game. By this point, the game was actually pretty solid. It was a put-together game. It was really close to being finished, but George Broussard and Take-Two Interactive do not like each other. I couldn't imagine why throughout the amazing history the two have had together. But they built up the courage and sat down with Take-Two Interactive and asked for $6 million to finish the game. Now, according to Broussard and Miller, Take-Two Interactive initially agreed, but then they offered only $2.5 million. Take-Two maintains that they offered the $2.5 million upfront and another $2.5 million on the completion of the game. George Broussard, for his part, just straight up declined the offer. That makes sense. On May 6, 2009, they announced that they suspended full-time development of Duke Nukem Forever, which in hindsight is just another thing to add to the absolutely confusing history of George Broussard. 3D Realms then laid off the Duke Nukem Forever staff on May 8, 2009 due to a lack of money. Also in 2009, Take-Two Interactive just casually filed a lawsuit against 3D Realms over their failure to complete Duke Nukem Forever. They cited the $12 million they paid to Infograins in 2000 for the publishing rights to Duke Nukem Forever as the reason for the lawsuit. 3D Realms argued that they had not received that money as it was a direct agreement between Infograins and Take-Two. But if I'm being completely honest with you, this entire lawsuit bores me. It is complete he said, she said bullshit that I could not care less about. They just wanted their money back. Take-Two didn't really spend any money to begin with, and yeah, it's just a bunch of bullshit. 3D Realms then planned to hire an external development team to try and finish the game, but that really never went anywhere. By 2010, the game's development was pretty much dead, and 3D Realms and Take-Two had settled their lawsuit. But as it turned out, the discontinuation of the development, however, was not completely discontinued, as 9 employees continued to work on the game in their spare time, but obviously it was slow. They had other jobs and they weren't really able to fully finish the game. These 9 employees decided to found Triptych Games, an independent studio which would be housed in the same building as Gearbox Software. 3D Realms, after ceasing development, would come together with Triptych Games and ask Gearbox to help them finish the game. Gearbox Software CEO Randy Pitchford, which no, I am not doing an episode that involves him because I'd rather not do that. Anyway, it turns out Randy Pitchford worked on an expansion for Duke Nukem 3D and very briefly worked on Duke Nukem Forever before he left to found Gearbox. He had a soft spot in his heart for Duke and he truly liked the IP. He started funding full-time development and they got to work. They were able to convince Take-Two to put up the money to help publish the game. Also around this time, 2K and Gearbox had hired Piranha Games to port the game from PC to Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. They would be responsible also for adding multiplayer. The game was officially re-announced at Penny Arcade Expo 2010 on September 3rd, 2010. It was the first time in the game's development history that gamers were able to actually play the game. In this deal, Gearbox Software acquired the Duke Nukem Forever IP from 3D Realms. 2K Games would still be holding exclusive long-term publishing rights for the game. But let's be real, that's never really going to actually be worth anything for 2K Games. Also, if any of you are confused because I don't think I distinctively said this, 2K is Take-Two. So when I'm saying Take-Two, it's also 2K. And when I'm saying 2K, it's also Take-Two. They're the same fucking thing. With the game about to be finished around 2011, only minor polishing was even done. They just needed the game to get out the door already. So they got it into the most playable state possible and released it. The game would be finally released June 13th, 2011. With the game finally releasing, that would put an end to a long development of Duke Nukem Forever, all 14 years of development. Except no the fuck it didn't, because Gearbox then sued 3D Realms for trying to make a sequel to Duke Nukem Forever. With Gearbox obviously acquiring the IP, they're probably wondering what the fuck are you guys doing, and eventually 3D Realms issued an apology and the lawsuit was settled. And finally, that is the end of the story. Except of course it isn't, because then 3D Realms would sue Gearbox. But this was a bunch of bullshit, and there's not even worth talking about it much. 3D Realms would ultimately drop it in just a couple months and issue an apology. Because, of course they did. But yes, that is the end of Duke Nukem Forever's story. Nobody else sued each other. Nobody else did a bunch of nonsense. Finally, yes. Finally, DNF is finished. Duke Nukem Forever can finally lay in the gaming graveyard forever at peace. If you have any other suggestions for what I should cover next, leave them in the comment section below. And my main source is in the link in the description below, as well as the links to the YouTube channels of the content I used. Special thanks to MK Ice and Fire for most of the content in the background. Greatly appreciated, of course. He's a great channel. Go check him out. With that being said, I reached out to George Broussard for a comment, but unfortunately he did not get back to me in time for, well, this video. I don't think he wants to relive this time in his life anyway, so I don't really blame him for not even wanting to reach out. It is completely a normal and acceptable thing when something goes wrong that you don't want to relive it. And honestly, he shouldn't have to. With that being said, I'm going to go rest now because this video was very painful to make. I won't go into much more detail, but you get the point. Ultimately, if you have any suggestions for our next game we're going to show, please leave it in the comment section below. And if you notice that the quality drops off about halfway through, that's because I ran out of time. I hope you still enjoyed it, though. Have a good one.
Sometimes life is like this dark tunnel. You can't always see the light at the end of the tunnel. But if you just keep moving, you will come to a better place.